Hello everyone. Tonight I prepared a special compilation of trucker stories, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now let's begin. The Howling Highway. From Marcus Chen, I've been driving these mountain highways for 23 years, hauling everything from electronics to fresh produce across the Pacific Northwest. My Peterbilt 379 and I have seen our share of strange weather, from ice storms that turn the road into a skating rink, to fog so thick you could cut it with a knife. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what I encountered on Highway 14 that October night when the wind learned how to growl. The evening started normal enough. I was pulling a full load of canned goods from a processing plant in Yakima, bound for Portland before dawn. The weather report had mentioned high winds, but that's nothing unusual for the Columbia River Gorge. Those canyon walls funnel air like a natural wind tunnel, and I'd driven through plenty of gusts that could push even my 80,000-pound rig around like a toy. I cranked up the CB radio, adjusted my mirrors, and settled in for what I thought would be a routine run through familiar territory. The first hint something was different came around midnight. Just as I was approaching the entrance to the gorge, the wind had been picking up steadily for the past hour, starting as gentle pushes against my trailer and building to the kind of steady pressure that makes you grip the steering wheel a little tighter. But as I rounded the bend near Maryhill, the character of the wind changed completely. Instead of the usual whoosh and whistle I'd grown accustomed to, I heard something that made me ease off the throttle and lean forward in my seat. The wind was making a sound like breathing. Deep rhythmic inhalations and exhalations that seemed to come from everywhere at once. At first I convinced myself it was just the usual wind patterns being distorted by the canyon walls, maybe amplified by the hollow spaces in my empty trailer behind me. But as I continued deeper into the gorge, the breathing sounds grew more distinct, more purposeful, as if something massive was using the entire valley as its lungs. I tried the CB radio, hoping to catch another driver who might be experiencing the same phenomenon, but all I got was static mixed with what sounded like whispers in a language I couldn't identify. The usual chatter from other truckers was completely absent, which was strange enough on its own. Highway 14 is heavily trafficked at all hours, and there's almost always someone on the radio sharing road conditions or just passing the time with conversation. The silence was more unnerving than any ghost story I'd ever heard over the airwaves. The breathing sounds continued for another 20 miles, growing deeper and more resonant until I could feel the vibrations through my seat. My coffee mug rattled against the cup holder, and the small compass mounted on my dashboard began spinning wildly, as if it couldn't decide which direction was north. The headlights cut through the darkness ahead, illuminating the familiar ribbon of asphalt, but something about the landscape looked different. The trees lining the highway seemed to lean inward at impossible angles, their branches reaching across the road like gnarled fingers trying to meet in the middle. That's when the breathing stopped, and the growling began. It started low, almost subsonic, a rumbling that I felt in my chest before I actually heard it with my ears. The sound seemed to rise from the asphalt itself, as if the road was some living thing that had been disturbed from sleep. My mirrors vibrated with the frequency, creating a constant blur that made it impossible to see if anything was following me. The growling grew louder and more complex, developing harmonics and overtones that suggested intelligence, purpose, maybe even anger. I pressed harder on the accelerator, but the growling matched my speed exactly, maintaining its position all around my truck like an invisible pack of predators keeping pace. The sound was coming from the wind itself, I realized, but wind doesn't growl with such intention, such obvious malevolence. This was something else entirely, something that had learned to use the moving air as its voice, its hunting call, its warning to intruders in its territory. My speedometer showed 75, well above the speed limit, but not unreasonable given the circumstances. The growling rose in pitch and intensity, and I felt my trailer beginning to sway despite the heavy load. The wind was no longer just making noise. It was actively trying to push me off the road, Gusts hit from alternating sides, each one perfectly timed to capitalize on my truck's momentum and send me sliding toward the guardrail or the oncoming lane. The dashboard lights flickered as my electrical system struggled against some kind of interference. My GPS screen went black, then displayed a map of terrain that didn't match anything I'd ever seen before, showing roads that curved in impossible spirals and destinations with names written in symbols instead of letters. The radio crackled back to life, but instead of trucker chatter, it broadcast what sounded like a weather report from another world, describing atmospheric conditions that included phrases like probability of despair and winds of forgetting with gusts up to eternity. I forced myself to focus on the road ahead, using the center line as my anchor to reality, while everything else around me seemed to shift and change. The growling had become almost conversational, rising and falling in patterns that suggested communication, as if the wind was trying to tell me something important. I caught myself leaning toward the driver's side window, straining to understand, when a particularly violent gust nearly sent my trailer jackknifing across both lanes. The realization hit me then that whatever was making these sounds wanted me to listen, wanted me to slow down and pay attention, wanted me to stop. Every trucker knows that stopping on a dark highway is dangerous under the best circumstances, but something deep in my survival instinct screamed that stopping here, in this place where the wind had learned to growl like a living thing, would be the last mistake I'd ever make. I downshifted and pushed my old Peterbilt harder than I had in years, the diesel engine roaring in defiance of whatever surrounded us. The growling responded immediately, becoming so loud that it drowned out my own engine noise. The sound was everywhere now, above and below, coming through the ventilation system and vibrating up through the seat. It felt like being inside the throat of some impossibly large creature, one that was deciding whether to swallow or spit me out. My headlights began to flicker, threatening to leave me in complete darkness, when I spotted something ahead that filled me with more relief than I'd ever felt in my life. It was another truck, a big rig with running lights that looked like a constellation of safety in the hostile darkness. I flashed my high beams and reached for the CB, hoping to make contact with another human being who could confirm I wasn't losing my mind. But as I got closer, I realized the other truck wasn't moving. It was parked sideways across both lanes, blocking the highway completely. I hit the brakes and felt my trailer slide on the asphalt as I fought to bring 80,000 pounds to a controlled stop. As my headlights played across the scene, I could see that the cab was empty, its door hanging open, but the engine was still running. The driver was nowhere to be seen. The growling stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so complete that it seemed to press against my eardrums. I sat in my truck, engine idling, staring at the abandoned rig and trying to decide what to do next. I couldn't turn around on the narrow highway, and there was no way to squeeze past the blocking truck. I would have to get out, find the other driver, or move his rig myself, or wait until morning for help to arrive. That's when I heard footsteps on gravel, slow and deliberate, circling my truck. But when I checked my mirrors, I saw nothing but darkness. The footsteps continued, keeping to the shadows just beyond the reach of my lights, accompanied by a low whistle that might have been human, or might have been the wind learning a new song. I locked my doors and reached for my cell phone, but the screen showed no signal, no connection to the world beyond this haunted stretch of highway. The whistling grew closer, and I made the hardest decision of my driving career. I put my truck in reverse, backed up until I had room to maneuver, then drove straight through the ditch beside the road. My rig bucked and swayed as it left the pavement, but the heavy load kept me stable enough to navigate around the abandoned truck and back onto the highway beyond. As soon as my wheels hit asphalt again, my headlights steadied, my radio crackled back to normal chatter, and my GPS showed the familiar map of Highway 14 leading safely toward Portland. I didn't slow down until I reached the truck stop at Cascade Locks, where I called the state police to report the abandoned vehicle. They thanked me for the information, but later told me they found nothing at the location I described. I still drive Highway 14 regularly, but never at night. and I always check the weather report twice before heading into the gorge. The other truckers think I'm getting soft in my old age, but they haven't heard what I've heard. The soil beneath my nails. For Marcus, the interstate stretched ahead like a black ribbon under the pale moonlight, and my 18-wheeler hummed its familiar tune as I pushed through the Nevada desert on my way to Sacramento. I'd been hauling construction equipment for the better part of 15 years, and these long nights had become as natural to me as breathing. The radio crackled with distant voices of other drivers, their conversations drifting in and out of static, but mostly it was just me, the road, and the steady rhythm of diesel burning through the darkness. It was somewhere past Fallon when I noticed the hitchhiker. He stood beneath the sickly yellow glow of a rest stop light, thumb extended, wearing clothes that seemed too clean for someone who'd been walking the highway. Something about his posture struck me as odd, the way he held himself perfectly still as if he'd been carved from stone and positioned there by careful hands. I'd picked up plenty of travelers over the years, mostly down on their luck folks who needed a ride to the next town, and my conscience wouldn't let me leave someone stranded in the middle of nowhere. I pulled the rig to a gentle stop, air brakes hissing in the cool night air. The man approached with measured steps, his face partially hidden in shadow, but I could make out sharp cheekbones and eyes that seemed to catch the truck's running lights in an unusual way. He climbed into the cab without saying much beyond a quiet thank you, and settled into the passenger seat with an economy of movement that suggested he was used to traveling light. "Where you headed?" I asked as we merged back onto the highway, the trailer swaying slightly as we found our rhythm again. The man stared out the windshield for a long moment before answering, his voice carrying a strange quality that made me think of wind moving through empty spaces. "West," he said simply. "Just keep driving west." The conversation died after that, and I found myself stealing glances at my passenger as we rolled through the darkness. He sat perfectly upright, hands folded in his lap, never shifting position or reaching for a phone or book. Most hitchhikers were chatty or restless, eager to share their stories or explain how they'd ended up walking the interstate. But this man seemed content to watch the desert scroll past in silence. It was when I reached for my thermos of coffee that I noticed his fingernails. They were black underneath, packed with what looked like rich, dark soil. The dirt was so deeply embedded that it seemed like it had been there for weeks, maybe months. My grandfather had hands like that from working his farm, but this was different somehow. The soil looked almost wet, despite the dry desert air that had been pulling moisture from everything for hundreds of miles. "You work construction?" I asked, nodding toward his hands. He followed my gaze and seemed surprised to see the dirt there, as if he'd forgotten about it entirely. "Something like that," he replied, and I noticed he didn't make any effort to hide his hands or explain the strange soil. Instead, he opened my glove compartment with a casual familiarity that sent a small chill down my spine. I was about to say something about going through my things when he paused, staring into the compartment with an expression I couldn't quite read. "That's interesting," he said, his voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity. I couldn't see what had caught his attention from my angle, but I knew there was nothing unusual in there. Registration papers, a tire pressure gauge, some pens, maybe a pack of gum. "Standard trucker supplies." "What's interesting?" I asked, but he'd already closed the compartment and returned his attention to the road ahead. The whole exchange left me feeling unsettled in a way I couldn't articulate. There was something wrong about the casual way he'd opened my glove box, as if he owned the truck instead of me. We drove in silence for another hour, the landscape gradually shifting from flat desert to rolling hills dotted with scrub brush, and the occasional cluster of lights marking some small town. The radio had gone completely quiet, not even static. Just an empty hiss that made the cab feel isolated from the rest of the world. I found myself checking the mirrors more often than necessary, though I couldn't say what I expected to see back there. The man seemed to be sleeping, or at least his eyes were closed, but something about his posture suggested he was still alert. His breathing was too controlled, too regular, like someone consciously managing each inhalation and exhalation. The smell of earth had grown stronger since he'd opened the glove compartment, a rich, loamy scent that reminded me of freshly turned soil after a spring rain. When we stopped for fuel at a truck stop outside Reno, the man remained in the cab while I filled the tanks and grabbed a fresh cup of coffee from the all-night diner. The place was nearly empty except for a tired-looking waitress and another trucker who was studying a road atlas with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. I mentioned my passenger to the other driver, describing the man's unusual stillness and the dirt under his nails. "Sounds like you picked up one of those cemetery workers," he said without looking up from his map. "They got a big operation up near Sacramento, a lot of expansion going on. Probably just tired from digging graves all day." That explanation should have put me at ease, but instead it made me more uncomfortable. There had been something too deliberate about the way the man had opened my glove compartment. And cemetery workers didn't typically hitchhike hundreds of miles to get to work. When I returned to the truck, he was exactly where I'd left him. Hands folded, staring straight ahead as if he hadn't moved so much as an inch while I was gone. "Find everything you needed?" he asked as I settled back into the driver's seat. And there was an odd emphasis on the word everything that made me pause before starting the engine. "Just fuel and coffee," I replied, but as we pulled back onto the interstate, I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been asking about something else entirely. The smell of earth had grown even stronger, almost overwhelming now, as if someone had dumped a wheelbarrow full of fresh soil into the cab. It was then that I realized the smell was coming from the glove compartment. The plastic seemed to be bulging slightly, as if something inside was pressing against it from within. My registration papers were probably getting crushed along with whatever else was in there, but I didn't want to check while my passenger was watching. There was something predatory about the way he'd positioned himself, angled slightly toward me as if waiting for my reaction. Instead, I focused on driving, keeping my eyes on the road and my hands steady on the wheel. The highway curved through mountain passes now, and patches of fog drifted across the asphalt like ghostly fingers. My passenger seemed more alert as we climbed higher, his head turning slightly as if he were listening for something beyond the range of normal hearing. "Pull over at the next rest area," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the engine noise with surprising clarity. There was no request in his tone, no politeness, just a flat command that made my chest tighten with sudden anxiety. "We'll be in Sacramento in a couple hours," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I can drop you wherever you need to go. Pull over now." The glove compartment popped open on its own, spilling soil across the floor of the cab. Rich, black earth poured out in an impossible volume, far more than could have possibly fit in that small space. The dirt kept coming, spreading across my feet and filling the air with the overwhelming scent of decay and growth. Life and death mixed together in a way that made my stomach turn. I yanked the wheel to the right, taking the next exit too fast. Trailer swaying dangerously as we careened toward a deserted rest area, perched on the edge of a steep ravine. The passenger door flew open before I'd even come to a complete stop, and the man stepped out into the swirling fog with that same measured precision he'd shown all night. But instead of walking away, he turned back toward the truck, and in the pale light of the parking area, I could finally see his face clearly. His eyes were the color of turned earth, and his skin had the gray pallor of someone who spent their time far beneath the surface of the world. Soil continued to pour from the open glove compartment, more and more of it. Impossible amounts that defied every law of physics I thought I understood. "Thank you for the ride," he said, and his voice seemed to come from somewhere deep underground. "We'll find our own way from here." That's when I noticed the others. They emerged from the fog like shadows gaining substance, men and women in various states of decay and preservation, all with that same rich soil packed beneath their fingernails and falling from their clothes with each step. They moved toward the truck with purpose, hands reaching for the sides of the trailer, and I realized with growing horror that they weren't interested in me at all. They were going home. The truth frequency. From Marcus Bell, the CB radio had been rattling for 3 days straight, and I was starting to think I'd picked up a busted unit from that truck stop in Amarillo. Every time I keyed the mic, every time I responded to another driver's call, that little black box mounted above my sleeper would shake like it was coming apart at the rivets. At first I figured it was just road vibration working its way through my Peterbilt's cab. But the rattling only happened when I spoke into the radio, and it was getting worse with each mile I put behind me. I was hauling refrigerated produce from California to Atlanta, running hard through the Arizona desert on Interstate 40. When the rattling started to follow a pattern I couldn't ignore, the CB would shake violently when I told Hammer Down Joe that my load was running on time, even though I was already 6 hours behind schedule. It rattled when I assured Moondog Mary that I'd gotten plenty of sleep at the last truck stop, though I'd only managed 2 restless hours before hitting the road again. Most unsettling of all, it practically bounced off its mounting bracket when I told Desert Rose that everything was running smooth as silk, despite the fact that my reefer unit had been cycling erratically for the past 100 miles. The desert stretched out endlessly on both sides of the highway, a moonlit landscape of sagebrush and distant mountains that seemed to mock my growing unease. My headlights cut through the darkness ahead, illuminating the broken yellow line that disappeared into the night like a promise that might not be kept. The hum of my diesel engine provided a steady backdrop to the occasional crackle of CB chatter, trucker voices floating through the static like ghosts sharing stories in the dark. I tried to convince myself it was coincidence, just a loose connection or a failing circuit board, but deep down I knew something was wrong with that radio. The rattling had a deliberate quality to it, like it was trying to tell me something I didn't want to hear. When I spoke the truth into the microphone, when I gave honest answers about road conditions or genuine thanks for traffic updates, the CB sat silent and still as a grave marker. But the moment I stretched the truth, bent it even slightly, that radio would come alive with violent shaking. Around midnight, as I climbed through the mountains near Flagstaff, I decided to test my growing suspicion. I keyed the mic and called out to any drivers heading eastbound, asking about smoky reports ahead. A voice came back through the static identifying himself as Thunder Road Tim, warning me about a speed trap around mile marker 201. Thanks for the heads up. Good, buddy, I replied, and the CB remained perfectly still. Then I added, I'm running legal anyway, so no worries here, even though my speedometer showed I was pushing 10 over the limit. The CB rattled so hard it sounded like it might tear itself loose from its mounting screws. The violent shaking sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air seeping through my door seals. I eased off the accelerator, bringing my speed down to exactly 55 miles per hour, and tried to rationalize what was happening. Electronics could be sensitive to all sorts of interference, power lines, radio towers, even atmospheric conditions. But as the miles rolled by and I became more conscious of every word I spoke into that microphone, the pattern held with disturbing consistency. Truth produced silence. Lies produced that bone-rattling shake. The thought crept into my mind like frost forming on a windshield. What if I'd picked up more than just a CB radio at that truck stop? The older driver who'd sold it to me had seemed eager to get rid of it, practically shoving it into my hands when I'd shown interest. He'd been thin as a rail with hollow eyes that seemed to look through me rather than at me. And when I'd asked why he was selling such a nice unit, he just muttered something about needing to travel lighter. I tried to remember his exact words as I navigated the winding mountain highway, my truck's engine groaning under the strain of the grade. He'd said something about the radio being good at keeping a driver honest, and at the time, I'd thought he meant it helped maintain good communication with other truckers. Now, as I watched that CB unit sitting silent in the green glow of my dashboard lights, I wondered if he'd meant something else entirely. The rattling was getting stronger, more insistent, and I found myself choosing my words carefully when other drivers called out. Simple acknowledgments, genuine thanks, honest road reports, all produced blessed silence. But when I tried to be polite about declining an invitation to join a convoy, claiming I was taking a different route instead of admitting I preferred to travel alone. The CB shook like it was powered by its own private earthquake. Around 2 in the morning, as I descended toward Winslow, the radio crackled to life with an unfamiliar voice. The signal was weak, drifting in and out of static, but I could make out someone calling for a driver in a blue Peterbilt. The voice described my truck perfectly, down to the chrome stacks and the faded trucking company decals on my sleeper. "Blue Pete, you out there?" The voice called again, and this time it was clearer, though something about the tone made my skin crawl. "Got some questions for you, driver." I hesitated, my finger hovering over the mic button. Something about this felt wrong, like stepping into a trap I couldn't see. But CB protocol was CB protocol, and ignoring a direct call went against everything I'd learned in 20 years of long-haul driving. "This is the Blue Pete," I replied. "Go ahead." "Been watching you drive, partner," the voice said, and now I could hear an odd echo behind the words, as if they were coming from somewhere hollow and empty. "Been listening to your conversations. Got to wondering about that load you're carrying." My blood turned to ice water. I glanced in my mirrors, scanning the highway behind me, but saw nothing except empty asphalt and the occasional reflector post. My reefer unit hummed steadily, maintaining the precise temperature needed to keep my produce fresh. But suddenly that familiar sound seemed ominous in the desert darkness. "Just hauling some vegetables," I said, which was mostly true. The CB remained still. "All legal and proper?" the voice asked, and there was something hungry in the way it spoke those words. I thought about the logbook sitting on my passenger seat, about the hours I'd fudged to make this delivery window, about the weight distribution I hadn't bothered to check properly at my last stop. My mouth felt dry as desert sand. "Everything's in order," I replied, and the CB exploded into violent motion, rattling so hard it sounded like machine gun fire in the quiet cab. Static filled the channel, but through the white noise I could hear laughter, low and satisfied, like something that had just confirmed what it already suspected. The radio fell silent for a long moment, and I found myself holding my breath, waiting for whatever came next. When the voice returned, it seemed closer somehow, as if the speaker had moved from wherever he'd been to somewhere much nearer my truck. "Funny thing about lies, driver. They have a way of catching up to you when you least expect it." I grabbed my mic with a shaking hand. "I don't know what you're talking about." The CB launched itself against its mounting bracket with such violence that I was sure it would break free. In the sudden silence that followed, I heard something that made my heart hammer against my ribs. The sound of another diesel engine, running close and parallel to my own. I checked my mirrors again, scanning left and right, but the highway remained empty. Yet I could clearly hear another truck, its engine note slightly different from mine, somewhere in the darkness around me. The sound seemed to come from all directions at once, like an audio mirage in the desert night. "Truth has a frequency all its own," the voice said through the static. "Some radios are tuned to pick it up. Others just pick up the interference when truth gets blocked." I pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing my speed up despite the mountain curves ahead. Whatever was happening, wherever that other truck was hiding, I needed to put distance between myself and this nightmare. But even as my speedometer climbed, the sound of that phantom engine kept pace, never falling behind, never pulling ahead. The CB crackled again. "Can't outrun what you've already let inside, driver. That radio's been learning your voice, learning the difference between what you say and what you mean. And now it's got company." As if summoned by those words, I saw headlights appear in my passenger side mirror, not behind me but somehow beside me, occupying the same stretch of highway where no other lane existed. The lights paced my truck perfectly, maintaining an impossible parallel course through the desert darkness. I keyed the mic with desperate urgency. "I don't know what you want from me." The diminishing mile from Marcus Reed. The thing about driving long haul is that you start to notice patterns in places where patterns shouldn't exist. After 18 years behind the wheel of my Peterbilt, crossing every state line more times than I can count, I thought I'd seen every trick the highway could play on a tired mind. The mirages that dance on hot asphalt in Arizona, the way fog can make familiar exits vanish in Oregon, the strange echo of your own CB radio bouncing off mountain ranges in Colorado. But I'd never encountered anything quite like State Route 447 in Nevada, where the mile markers seemed to be counting down to something I wasn't sure I wanted to reach. It started on a Tuesday night in late October, the kind of night where the desert air carries a bite that makes you grateful for the steady rumble of diesel heating beneath the hood. I was hauling a load of electronics from Sacramento to Denver, running slightly behind schedule, but nothing that couldn't be managed with some careful route planning. My usual path would have taken me through Reno and then straight east on Interstate 80. But construction delays and a jackknifed semi had turned that familiar route into a parking lot of brake lights stretching beyond the horizon. The GPS offered an alternative that looked promising enough, a state route that would add maybe 40 minutes to my total time, but keep me moving instead of burning fuel in stop-and-go traffic. Route 447 cut through a stretch of Nevada I'd somehow managed to avoid in all my years of crossing the state. A narrow ribbon of asphalt that promised to connect me back to the interstate system north of Fernley. The road appeared straightforward on the digital display. Just a clean line through empty desert marked with the usual advisory about checking fuel levels and carrying water. I made the turn just after midnight, leaving behind the scattered glow of truck stops and fast food signs for the profound darkness that only exists in places where human settlement grows thin. The headlights of my Pete carved through blackness so complete it seemed almost solid, revealing nothing but the white lines of the road and the occasional glint of a reflector marking the shoulder. The engine settled into that comfortable rhythm that comes with highway cruising, a deep mechanical heartbeat that had lulled me through countless nights over the years. The first mile marker I noticed was number 73, appearing in my headlights like a white ghost before disappearing into the darkness behind me. Mile markers are such common fixtures of highway travel that they usually fade into background noise, but something about seeing that number made me more aware of the ones that followed. Mile 72 passed a few minutes later, then 71, each one confirming what seemed obvious enough, that I was progressing normally along a numbered route toward whatever destination lay at its end. But as mile 70 flashed past, then 69, then 68, I began to feel an odd sense of unease that I couldn't immediately identify. The numbers were decreasing in the expected fashion, marking my progress along the route, yet something about their steady countdown began to feel less like measurement and more like anticipation. Each white marker seemed to appear in my headlights with increasing significance, as if I were approaching some kind of deadline rather than simply traveling through empty desert. The landscape around me remained stubbornly uniform, an endless expanse of sagebrush and scattered rocks that reflected nothing in my headlights except their own stark existence. No buildings broke the horizon. No other vehicles shared the road. No signs indicated what might lie ahead at the route's terminus. The only variation in the monotonous scenery was the occasional wash where winter rains had carved shallow channels through the hardpan. Brief dips in the road that made my trailer bounce slightly before returning to the steady forward motion. Mile 65 brought with it the first hint that something might be genuinely wrong. As the marker emerged from the darkness ahead, my headlights caught what looked like a brief flicker in the white paint, as if the numbers had shifted slightly in the moment between appearing and passing. I checked my mirrors, but the marker had already vanished into the night behind me, leaving me to wonder if eye strain and highway hypnosis were beginning to play tricks on my perception. Mile 64 flickered more distinctly, the number seeming to pulse or breathe in the LED glare of my headlights. I slowed slightly, trying to get a better look at mile 63, and this time there was no mistaking what I saw. The numbers on the marker weren't simply painted or stamped into the metal. They were glowing with their own soft radiance, a phosphorescent gleam that had nothing to do with reflected light. As I drew alongside the marker, I could swear I heard something like a faint electronic beeping, barely audible above the diesel rumble but distinctly present. The reasonable part of my mind suggested several explanations for what I was experiencing. Solar-powered LED displays weren't uncommon on modern highway infrastructure, and the beeping could easily be some kind of maintenance signal or traffic monitoring system. But those explanations felt inadequate as mile 62 approached, its glow visible from much farther away than should have been possible, casting strange shadows among the sagebrush that seemed to move independently of my truck's motion. I reached for my CB radio, thinking to contact other drivers who might be familiar with this route, but the airways were filled with nothing except static, and the occasional burst of interference that sounded almost like distant voices speaking in no language I could recognize. My cell phone showed no signal bars, which wasn't surprising given the remote location. But the dead screen felt more ominous than it should have in the growing strangeness of the night. Mile 61 brought a new development that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. The marker itself looked normal enough, still glowing with that eerie internal light, but the landscape around it had changed in subtle ways that took me a moment to identify. The sagebrush seemed denser somehow and taller, creating shapes in the darkness that looked almost intentional. More unsettling still, I could see lights in the distance for the first time since turning onto the route. Tiny points of illumination scattered across what should have been empty desert. As mile 60 approached, those distant lights resolved into something that made no sense according to my understanding of Nevada geography. They weren't the random scatter of ranch buildings or mining operations, but the organized grid of a substantial town, complete with streetlights and illuminated buildings that stretched far enough to suggest a population in the thousands. No town of that size existed in this part of the state, I was certain of it. Yet there it lay spread across the desert floor like something transplanted from a completely different landscape. The beeping sound grew stronger as I passed mile 59, no longer barely audible but clearly present as a steady electronic pulse that seemed to synchronize with the glowing markers. Each pulse brought with it a brief moment of disorientation, as if reality itself was flickering in time with the sound. The steering wheel felt different in my hands, sometimes familiar worn plastic and sometimes smooth metal that belonged to no truck I'd ever driven. Mile 58 marked the point where I seriously considered turning around and finding another route, regardless of the time it might cost me. But when I checked my mirrors, hoping to find a wide spot suitable for turning my rig around, the road behind me had vanished into a wall of absolute blackness that my taillights couldn't penetrate. The darkness looked solid somehow, as if it were made of something heavier than mere absence of light, and the idea of backing into it filled me with an instinctive dread I couldn't explain. The town that couldn't exist grew larger and more detailed as I continued forward, its lights now bright enough to cast a glow against the low clouds that had appeared without my noticing. I could make out individual buildings, water towers, even what looked like traffic moving along illuminated streets. But something was wrong with the scale or the perspective, because the town seemed to be both approaching and receding simultaneously, growing larger and more detailed while never actually getting any closer. Mile 57 brought the sound of music drifting across the desert, a faint melody that seemed to come from the direction of the impossible town. It was the kind of music you might hear from a carousel or circus calliope, cheerful and innocent yet somehow inappropriate in the empty darkness of the Nevada desert. The melody was just familiar enough to be frustrating, like a song I'd known in childhood but couldn't quite remember, and it seemed to synchronize with the pulsing of the mile markers in a way that made my teeth ache. As mile 56 passed, I realized that the countdown had become the focal point of my entire existence, each approaching marker representing some kind of threshold I was powerless to avoid crossing. The truck continued forward with mechanical inevitability, my foot holding steady pressure on the accelerator despite every instinct telling me to stop. The engine note had changed slightly, taking on harmonics that seemed to resonate with the electronic beeping and the distant carnival music. Mile 55 brought the first clear view of what lay at the heart of the mysterious town, and what I saw there made me understand why the markers were counting down rather than up. In the center of the illuminated grid, where a courthouse or city hall should have stood. There was instead a structure that defied easy description. White smoke rising, from Jake Martinez. The first thing you learn about diesel engines is that white smoke means trouble, and I should have known better than to ignore it that October night when my Peterbilt started breathing like a dying man. I'd been hauling refrigerated goods from Seattle to Denver for the better part of 15 years, and my old girl had never let me down before. But as I crested the pass through the Cascade Mountains, the telltale white plume began threading from my exhaust stack like ghostly fingers reaching into the star-drunk sky. The temperature gauge held steady. Oil pressure looked good, but that smoke kept coming thick and constant, catching the moonlight and spreading behind me in an ethereal wake that made my mirrors look like they were frosting over. I'd planned to push through to Spokane before taking my mandatory rest, but the nearest truck stop was still 40 miles ahead, and something about the way that white smoke moved in the wind made my skin crawl in ways I couldn't quite explain. The highway stretched before me like a black ribbon, empty save for the occasional car that would materialize in my headlights, pass by in a whoosh of displaced air, and disappear into the darkness behind me. Each time one approached, I watched in my mirrors as they drove directly through that plume of white smoke. And each time, something strange happened. Their taillights would flicker, just for a moment, as if the smoke were interfering with their electrical systems, and then they'd accelerate rapidly, as though eager to put distance between themselves and whatever was following them. I tried raising other drivers on the CB radio, Channel 19 crackling with the usual mix of road conditions and idle chatter, but every time I keyed the mic to ask about the smoke, the radio would fill with static so thick it sounded like whispers. I'd release the button and the channel would clear immediately, conversations resuming as if nothing had happened. After the third attempt, I gave up trying to reach anyone and focused on the road ahead, the engine's steady rumble now accompanied by an almost musical quality that seemed to rise and fall with the terrain. The mountains on either side of the highway loomed like sleeping giants, their peaks lost in low-hanging clouds that reflected the moon's pale light. My headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness, illuminating the painted yellow lines that marked the center of the road and the occasional deer that would freeze at the forest's edge before bounding back into the safety of the trees. But it was what I couldn't see that worried me most. That white smoke continuing to pour from my exhaust, now so thick it created its own weather system behind my trailer. I finally crested another hill and saw the blessed glow of a truck stop ahead, its neon signs promising fuel, food, and rest. But as I began my descent toward the valley floor, I noticed something that made my hands tighten on the wheel. The white smoke wasn't just trailing behind me anymore. It was beginning to flow alongside the truck, moving against the prevailing wind like it had developed a mind of its own. Long tendrils of the stuff were creeping forward, reaching past my mirrors toward the cab, and wherever it touched my truck's chrome, the metal seemed to tarnish instantly, developing a patina that looked decades old. The truck stop grew larger in my windshield, and I could make out the familiar sight of other big rigs parked in neat rows, their running lights creating constellations of red and amber against the purple sky. I downshifted and began applying my brakes, but instead of the usual pneumatic hiss of the air system, I heard something else, a sound like breathing, deep and rhythmic, coming from somewhere beneath the truck. The white smoke was now pouring from every gap in the engine compartment, seeping through the hood latches and rising from the wheel wells like morning fog. As I pulled into the truck stop's main drive, the automatic lights flickered on to guide me toward an empty parking space, but their illumination revealed something that made my blood run cold. The white smoke wasn't dissipating in the open air as it should have. Instead, it was forming shapes, recognizable forms that moved with purpose and intelligence. I caught glimpses of faces in the swirling mist, expressions of longing and desperation that would coalesce for a moment before dissolving back into the larger mass. I guided my truck to a parking spot at the far end of the lot, away from the other vehicles, and as I applied the parking brake, the engine finally fell silent. but the white smoke continued to pour out, now accompanied by a sound like wind chimes made of bone. I sat in my cab watching through my mirrors as the smoke began to circle the truck, creating a barrier between me and the outside world. The faces in the mist were clearer now, and I recognized some of them. Drivers I'd known over the years who had simply vanished from the road, their trucks found abandoned, their logbooks ending mid-sentence. The temperature inside my cab began to drop, and I could see my breath forming small puffs of vapor that were immediately drawn toward the windows, as if the white smoke outside was calling to anything that resembled its own ethereal nature. I reached for my cell phone to call for help, but the screen showed no signal, and when I tried to start the engine again, hoping to drive through whatever was happening, the key turned uselessly, the starter clicking but failing to engage. Through my windshield, I could see the truck stop's main building, warm light spilling from its windows, other drivers moving about inside, completely unaware of the nightmare unfolding in their parking lot. I tried honking my horn, but instead of the usual blast, it produced a mournful wail that seemed to harmonize with the sound of the wind chimes. The white smoke pressed closer to the cab, and I could feel a strange pulling sensation, as if something was trying to draw the very essence of life from my body. That's when I realized the truth about the white smoke. It wasn't a mechanical problem at all, but something far older and more sinister. This stretch of highway had claimed too many drivers over the years, and their spirits had found a way to manifest in the one thing that connected them all, the diesel exhaust that marked their passage through this world. They weren't trying to hurt me. I understood with sudden clarity. They were trying to recruit me, to add my essence to their wandering congregation of lost souls forever traveling roads that led nowhere. I fumbled for the door handle, knowing that my only chance was to break free before the smoke could complete whatever process it had started. The latch clicked and I pushed against the door, but it felt like I was moving through thick molasses, every motion requiring tremendous effort. The white smoke immediately began seeping into the cab through the opening, bringing with it the scent of diesel fuel mixed with something else, something organic and ancient that spoke of long journeys and final destinations. I pushed harder against the door and stumbled out into the parking lot, immediately breaking into a run toward the truck stop's main building. Behind me, I could hear the sound of the white smoke coalescing into something more solid, something that whispered my name with voices I almost recognized. My boots pounded against the asphalt, and I didn't look back until I reached the building's entrance, my hand on the glass door, safety just inches away. When I finally turned around, my truck was barely visible through a towering column of white smoke that rose into the night sky like a pillar of salt. But even as I watched, the smoke began to dissipate, drawn upward by winds that seemed to exist only for that purpose. Within minutes, it was gone completely, leaving my truck sitting innocently in the parking lot, looking as normal as any other big rig waiting for its driver's return. I spent that night in the truck stop's restaurant, drinking coffee and watching my truck through the windows, waiting for dawn to reveal whether what I'd experienced was real or just the product of too many hours on the road. When the sun finally rose, painting the mountains in shades of gold and pink, I walked cautiously back to my truck, expecting to find it damaged somehow, marked by its encounter with whatever had emerged from its exhaust system. But everything appeared completely normal. The engine started on the first try and the exhaust ran clear and clean as mountain air. I completed my run to Denver without incident, delivered my load on time, and filed my logbook with nothing more unusual noted than a brief stop for mechanical concerns. But even now, months later, I keep a close eye on my mirrors, watching for that first telltale wisp of white smoke that might signal the return of those lost drivers, still searching for someone to join their eternal convoy on highways that exist between the world of the living and whatever lies beyond. And sometimes, late at night when the road stretches empty before me, and my diesel engine hums its familiar song, I wonder if I really escaped it all, or if I'm already part of that white smoke, helping to guide other drivers toward their own moment of choice between the safety of the truck stop and the endless journey that calls from every mile of blacktop stretching toward the horizon. The Frequency of Lost Roads, from Marcus Holloway. The GPS died somewhere outside Bakersfield, its screen flickering twice before going black as midnight. I'd been driving my Peterbilt 379 for 14 years, hauling everything from furniture to farm equipment across this endless web of interstate highways, and I'd learned to trust technology about as far as I could throw my 18-wheeler. That's why I always kept a road atlas tucked behind the driver's seat, its pages worn soft from years of unfolding and refolding, coffee stains marking routes I'd taken 100 times before. The rain had been falling steadily for the past hour, creating a hypnotic rhythm against my windshield that made the wipers work overtime. Each sweep revealed another stretch of empty highway, the kind that seems to swallow headlight beams whole and spit back nothing but darkness. My load of industrial printing equipment was due in Phoenix by morning, and the detour I'd taken to avoid a jackknife semi had put me behind schedule. The fuel gauge showed half a tank, enough to get me where I needed to go if I could figure out exactly where that was. I pulled the atlas from its resting place and felt something unusual as my fingers traced the familiar weight of it. The book seemed heavier somehow, though I chalked that up to the late hour and my tired imagination. Truckers develop a sixth sense about these things, about when the road starts playing tricks on your mind, when the white lines begin to hypnotize you into seeing things that aren't there. I'd been driving for 8 hours straight, and fatigue has a way of making ordinary objects feel strange in your hands. Finding a wide shoulder beneath an overpass, I shifted into park and let the diesel engine idle while I opened the atlas to the California section. The cab filled with the familiar scent of worn paper and binding glue, comforting smells that reminded me of countless nights spent plotting routes under the glow of dome lights. But as I spread the book across my steering wheel, something made me pause. The pages felt different somehow, smoother than they should have been, and when I looked down at the map, I noticed something that made my breath catch in my throat. The roads were humming. It wasn't a sound I heard with my ears, not exactly. It was more like a vibration that traveled up through my fingertips when I touched the printed highways. A barely perceptible tremor that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. Interstate 5 thrummed with a deep, steady frequency, while the smaller state routes sang in higher pitches, creating a complex harmony that I felt more than heard. At first, I thought it might be the engine vibration traveling through the truck's frame, but when I lifted my hands away from the page, the sensation stopped completely. The rain continued its steady percussion on the roof as I stared down at the map, trying to make sense of what I was experiencing. The interstate I'd been following appeared clearly marked, but there were other roads shown now that I didn't remember seeing before. Thin red lines that curved and twisted through areas I could have sworn were marked as empty desert, connecting towns with names that sounded familiar but somehow wrong. Dustpan instead of Dustin. Palm Grove where I was sure there should be Palmdale. Serpent Springs in a location where I knew no town existed at all. When I traced these new roads with my finger, they hummed with different frequencies entirely. Some so low they felt like distant thunder, others so high they made my teeth ache. The sensation was oddly compelling, like discovering a radio frequency that played music you'd never heard but somehow recognized. Each route seemed to tell a story through its vibrations, speaking in a language of pitch and rhythm that bypassed my ears entirely and went straight to some deeper part of my understanding. My logical mind insisted this was nothing more than exhaustion, manifesting in strange ways. But the trucker in me, the part that had learned to read the subtle signs and portents of the highway, whispered that I should pay attention. Roads have moods and personalities. Any driver worth his commercial license knows that. Some stretches of asphalt welcome you like an old friend, while others seem to fight your tires with every mile. But this was something different, something that suggested the map itself had become a living thing, pulsing with the collective heartbeat of every mile of pavement it represented. I found my current position on the atlas and placed my finger on the overpass where I sat idling. The spot hummed with a medium frequency, not unpleasant, but somehow expectant, as if the road itself were waiting for me to make a decision. From my location, several routes branched out in different directions. The interstate continued south with its steady, reliable drone, but a smaller highway curved east toward what the map now labeled as Thornfield, humming with a melody that seemed almost beckoning. According to the atlas, this eastern route would actually save me 40 miles and get me back on schedule, perhaps even ahead of it. The town of Thornfield sat at a crossroads where I could connect with another highway that would take me straight into Phoenix without the usual traffic delays. It seemed too good to be true, which should have been my first warning. But the humming frequency of that road felt so inviting under my fingertip, like a siren song rendered in vibration rather than sound. The rain began to ease as I folded the atlas and shifted back into gear, turning my rig toward the exit that would take me to this alternative route. The pavement felt different under my wheels as soon as I made the transition, smoother somehow, as if it had been freshly laid despite the lack of any construction signs. My headlights carved through the diminishing precipitation, illuminating mile markers and reflectors that seemed to gleam with unusual brightness. For the first hour, everything seemed normal. The road curved gently through low hills and scrubland, exactly as the humming map had indicated. I passed a few other vehicles, their taillights disappearing behind me in the darkness, and saw the distant glow of what might have been a small town off to the north. The fuel gauge held steady, the engine maintained its reliable rhythm, and I began to think I'd stumbled onto one of those perfect shortcuts that truckers dream about finding. But gradually, subtle wrongnesses began to accumulate like dust on a windshield. The mile markers seemed to be counting in the wrong direction, showing increasing numbers when they should have been counting down toward my destination. The radio, which had been picking up a classic rock station clearly just minutes before, now produced only static shot through with what sounded almost like whispered conversations in languages I couldn't identify. Most unsettling of all, when I checked the atlas again at a red light in a small town that looked nothing like the Thornfield marked on the map, the roads were humming with entirely different frequencies, as if the book itself were somehow rewriting itself as I traveled. The town I passed through had the right name on its welcome sign, but everything else felt subtly wrong. The buildings were the correct general shapes for a small desert community, but their proportions seemed slightly off, as if they'd been constructed by someone working from imperfect memory, rather than blueprints. Streetlights cast pools of illumination that seemed too yellow, too thick, giving the empty sidewalks an underwater quality that made me unconsciously hold my breath as I drove through. It was then that I noticed the other trucks. At first I thought I was simply encountering other drivers who'd discovered the same shortcut, but something about their behavior struck me as odd. They maintained perfect spacing, exactly 1 mile apart according to my odometer, and they all appeared to be identical models driving at precisely the same speed. When I tried to close the distance to get a better look at the rig ahead of me, it seemed to accelerate just enough to maintain the gap. When I slowed down, the truck behind me somehow maintained its position as well, never getting closer but never falling back. The atlas continued to hum under my fingers each time I consulted it, but the frequencies had become discordant now, clashing against each other in ways that made my head throb. The roads shown on the page no longer matched what I could see through my windshield, displaying impossible curves and intersections that defied the flat desert landscape around me. Some highways on the map now appeared to loop back on themselves in perfect spirals, while others seemed to fade away mid-road, ending in blank spaces where towns should have been. My fuel gauge, which should have shown at least a quarter tank remaining, now hovered near empty despite the fact that I couldn't have burned through that much diesel in such a short time. Worse still, the landscape outside had become eerily repetitive, the same arrangement of hills and scrub brush cycling past my windows every few miles, as if I were driving through a loop of highway that had been copied and pasted across the desert. The other trucks maintained their perfect spacing, never varying their speed or position, creating a convoy that felt less like a coincidence and more like a trap. When I tried to exit this strange procession, by taking what appeared to be an off-ramp, my steering wheel seemed to resist my efforts, requiring all my strength to turn toward the exit. The moment my truck left the main roadway, the humming from the Atlas stopped completely. The dancing lights at mile marker 127. From Jake Morrison, I've been hauling freight across these northern highways for 17 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything the road had to offer. Midnight storms that turn your windshield into a kaleidoscope of water and light. Fog so thick it swallows your headlights like hungry mouths. Ice storms that make every mile feel like walking a tightrope over hell itself. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what I encountered on that humid July night when I took the exit marked only with a weathered sign that read rest area 2 miles. The evening had started like any other summer run from Minneapolis down to Kansas City, my Peterbilt 379 purring along Interstate 35 with a full load of agricultural equipment bound for the wheat country. The CB radio crackled with the usual chatter from other drivers, discussions about way stations and speed traps and which truck stops had the best pie. The air conditioning hummed steadily against the oppressive heat that seemed to radiate up from the asphalt even after sunset, and I had Jerry Jeff Walker playing softly through the speakers, his gravelly voice keeping me company as the miles rolled by beneath my wheels. It was just past 11:30 when I started feeling that familiar heaviness behind my eyes, the kind of fatigue that creeps up on you slow and steady like morning fog. I'd been driving since dawn, pushing to make good time, but the Department of Transportation doesn't care about your schedule when it comes to mandatory rest periods. I needed to find a place to park for a few hours, maybe catch some sleep in the sleeper cab before the heat of the next day made it unbearable. That's when I spotted the exit sign, barely visible in the amber glow of my headlights. Most of the paint had faded or peeled away, leaving only ghost impressions of letters that might have once spelled out a town name or highway designation. The rest area sign beneath it looked equally neglected, its reflective surface cracked and dulled by years of weather and neglect. But rest was rest, and I'd learned long ago not to be too picky about accommodations when you're running on 18 hours of coffee and determination. The off-ramp curved away from the interstate in a long, gentle arc that descended through thick stands of oak and maple trees. My headlights swept across their trunks as I downshifted, the engine brake adding its distinctive rumble to the night sounds filtering through my partially open window. Crickets chirped from the darkness beyond the tree line, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the lonesome call of a whippoorwill, that haunting 3-note song that always makes me think of childhood summers at my grandmother's farm. The rest area parking lot, when I finally reached it, was larger than I'd expected based on the condition of the signs. Cracked asphalt stretched away into the darkness, marked by faded yellow lines that divided the space into sections for cars, RVs, and trucks. A small brick building squatted in the center, its windows dark and uninviting, surrounded by picnic tables that looked like they hadn't seen maintenance in years. I pulled into one of the truck spaces near the far edge of the lot, where the tree line would provide some shade come morning, and killed the engine. The sudden silence felt almost oppressive after hours of road noise and engine rumble. I sat there for a moment, letting my ears adjust, becoming aware of new sounds that had been masked by the mechanical symphony of highway travel. The trees whispered and sighed in a breeze I couldn't feel through my windows, and somewhere nearby water trickled over stones, probably a small stream or drainage ditch. But there was something else, a sound I couldn't quite identify that seemed to pulse just at the edge of hearing, rhythmic and organic. I climbed down from the cab to stretch my legs and check the load straps, grateful to feel solid ground beneath my boots after so many hours of vibration and motion. The air hung thick and still, heavy with the scent of honeysuckle and something else, something sweet and cloying that reminded me of flowers left too long in a vase. The parking lot's few working light poles cast pools of sickly yellow illumination that seemed to emphasize the darkness rather than dispel it, creating harsh shadows that moved and shifted with the swaying branches overhead. That's when I first noticed the fireflies. They appeared slowly, one by one, tiny pinpricks of green-gold light winking in and out of existence among the trees. At first I thought nothing of it, having grown up in farm country where summer evenings were often punctuated by the magical dance of lightning bugs. But as I watched, more appeared, then more still, until the entire forest edge seemed to shimmer and pulse with their bioluminescent display. They moved in patterns that seemed almost too organized, too purposeful, flowing in streams and spirals that reminded me of schools of fish or flocks of starlings. I found myself walking toward them without consciously deciding to do so. Drawn by a beauty that was both familiar and somehow alien, the fireflies seemed to respond to my approach, their lights growing brighter, their movements becoming more animated. They swirled around me in loose helixes, close enough that I could feel the whisper-soft touch of their wings against my face and hands, their lights reflecting in countless tiny points across my skin and clothes. The sweet, cloying scent grew stronger as I followed their dance deeper into the trees, away from the parking lot and my truck. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a voice of caution tried to speak up, tried to remind me that I was tired and should be getting some rest, not wandering off into unknown woods in the middle of the night. But that voice seemed distant and unimportant compared to the hypnotic beauty of the lights that surrounded me, their gentle pulsing that seemed to match the rhythm of my own heartbeat. The trees closed around me, their canopy filtering the moonlight into a soft, dappled pattern on the forest floor. The fireflies led me along what might have once been a path, though it was overgrown now with ferns and wild grasses that brushed against my jeans with each step. The sound of running water grew louder, and soon I could make out the dark glimmer of a stream winding between moss-covered rocks and fallen logs. But it wasn't just water that reflected in the creek bed. There were lights beneath the surface, pale and phosphorescent, pulsing in rhythm with the fireflies that danced above. As I knelt beside the stream for a closer look, I realized with growing unease that the lights weren't reflections at all, but something moving just beneath the water's surface, something that glowed with its own cold radiance. The fireflies around me suddenly pulsed brighter, all at once, and in that moment of enhanced illumination I saw what lay at the bottom of the stream. Faces, dozens of them, pale and serene, eyes closed as if in peaceful sleep, hair flowing like underwater grass in the gentle current. They were beautiful in their repose, these drowned figures, but there was something wrong with them, something that made my rational mind recoil even as I found myself leaning closer to the water's edge. Their skin had a translucent quality, like wax paper or rice paper, and beneath it I could see the soft green glow of what I first took to be some kind of bioluminescence. But as my eyes adjusted to the underwater tableau, I realized the truth was far more disturbing. The glow came from within the figures themselves, from countless tiny lights that moved beneath their skin like living stars, like fireflies that had somehow found their way inside and made homes in the hollow spaces of abandoned bodies. The stream whispered past them with barely a murmur, as if reluctant to disturb their eternal slumber, and I understood with mounting horror that these weren't corpses in any conventional sense. They were something else, something that had been transformed by the lights that now inhabited them, changed into vessels for whatever intelligence guided the fireflies in their mesmerizing dance. One of the figures opened its eyes. The movement was so gradual, so smooth that I almost didn't notice it at first, but then more eyes opened, pale green orbs that held depths of light like captured stars, all turning to focus on me with an attention that was both utterly alien and terrifyingly aware. The figure closest to the bank began to rise, water streaming from its translucent form as it stood in the shallow creek, and I could see the fireflies within its body pulsing brighter, communicating in their silent language of light. The dancing fireflies around me suddenly converged, forming a tight spiral that descended toward my head and shoulders with clear intent. I could feel a strange numbness beginning to spread from the points where their lights touched my skin, a creeping sensation that started as warmth but quickly became something cold and invasive. They wanted inside, I realized with growing panic. They wanted to make me like the others, to transform me into another vessel for their collective consciousness. The Crimson Mile. From Jake Morrison, The stretch of Highway 49 through northern Michigan had always been my favorite run, especially during autumn when the maples and oaks painted the roadside in brilliant oranges and yellows. 23 years I'd been hauling freight through these parts, watching the seasons change like an old friend's moods. But that October night, something was different about the trees along that familiar corridor. Something that made my skin crawl beneath my flannel shirt as I gripped the steering wheel of my Peterbilt, a little tighter than usual. It started just past the Grayling exit, around 11:30 p.m., when my headlights began catching glimpses of red among the autumn foliage. Not the deep burgundy of dying leaves or the bright scarlet of sugar maples in their glory, but an unsettling shade that seemed to pulse and shift in my peripheral vision. At first I chalked it up to fatigue. I'd been on the road for 14 hours straight, pushing hard to make my delivery deadline in Marquette before dawn. The steady hum of my diesel engine and the rhythmic thump of tires on asphalt had lulled me into that twilight state where reality begins to blur at the edges. The radio crackled with static as I reached for the CB, hoping to catch some chatter from other drivers to keep me alert. Breaker 19, this is Wolverine Jake eastbound on 49. Anybody out there got their ears on? Nothing but white noise responded. Unusual for a highway that typically saw steady truck traffic even at this hour. I adjusted the squelch and tried again, but the static only grew thicker, almost aggressive in its intensity. That's when I noticed the trees were definitely wrong. The red I'd been catching glimpses of wasn't just on a few scattered branches anymore. Entire sections of forest on both sides of the highway glowed with that strange arterial color, as if someone had dipped massive paintbrushes in fresh blood and swept them across the tree line. The color seemed to move independently of any wind, rippling like liquid against the bark and leaves in patterns that hurt to look at directly. My CB suddenly burst to life with a voice I didn't recognize, gravelly and distorted through layers of static. Red trees mean you're getting close, driver. Better turn around while you still can. The transmission cut off before I could respond, leaving me staring at the microphone in my hand like it might bite me. I'd been trucking long enough to know that highway legends and ghost stories were part of the culture, but something about that voice made my mouth go dry. The trees grew redder as I continued east, their crimson glow now visible even without my headlights illuminating them directly. They seemed to be generating their own light, a soft phosphorescence that reminded me uncomfortably of the emergency lighting in hospital corridors. The highway curved gently through the forest, and with each bend, the red grew more intense, more alive. I could swear I saw movement within the tree line, shadows that didn't match the swaying branches, shapes that seemed to keep pace with my truck as I maintained a steady 55 miles per hour. My fuel gauge showed 3/4 full, and I briefly considered the CB voice's advice about turning around. But the next exit wasn't for another 30 miles, and something told me that stopping or even slowing down significantly might not be the wisest choice. The trees seemed to sense my presence now, their red glow pulsing in rhythm with my heartbeat, which I could feel hammering against my ribs despite my attempts to stay calm. The windshield began to fog slightly, even though my defroster was running full blast. When I reached up to wipe it clear, my hand came away damp with something that wasn't quite water. In the dim glow of my dash lights, the moisture on my palm looked distinctly pink, as if tinged with the same red that surrounded me outside. I grabbed a handful of napkins from the door pocket and cleaned the windshield more thoroughly, trying not to think about what might be seeping through the supposedly sealed cab of my truck. Mile marker 127 flashed past in my headlights, and I realized I should have hit the Roscommon exit by now. The highway seemed to be stretching itself, adding miles that shouldn't exist, keeping me trapped in this corridor of red trees that grew more agitated with each passing minute. The movement in the forest was unmistakable now. Not the random swaying of branches, but something deliberate and coordinated, as if the trees themselves were walking alongside me just beyond the reach of my lights. My engine began to labor slightly, the RPM needle fluctuating despite my steady pressure on the accelerator. The temperature gauge crept toward the yellow zone, unusual for the cool October night air that should have been keeping everything running efficiently. Through the floorboards, I could feel a vibration that didn't match the normal rhythm of my truck, something external that seemed to be affecting the entire vehicle from underneath. The CB crackled again, this time with multiple voices overlapping in an incomprehensible chorus of static and whispers. I caught fragments of words that sounded like warnings, pleas, and something that might have been coordinates. But the transmission was so distorted I couldn't make sense of any of it. What scared me most was that some of the voices sounded familiar, like drivers I'd known over the years, men who'd simply vanished from the highways without explanation. Ahead, the red glow intensified into what looked like a solid wall of crimson light, stretching across the highway. My headlights seemed to be absorbed by it rather than penetrating through, creating a barrier of luminescence that I was rapidly approaching at 55 miles per hour. Every instinct screamed at me to brake, but some deeper understanding warned me that stopping within this stretch of highway would be far worse than whatever lay ahead. I pressed harder on the accelerator instead, feeling the big Peterbilt surge forward with a growl of diesel power that sounded defiant against the oppressive silence that had fallen over the forest. The red wall rushed toward me, and in the seconds before impact, I caught a glimpse of faces within the light, human features twisted with expressions of terrible longing and regret, reaching toward my truck with outstretched arms that seemed to emerge from the trees themselves. The collision with the wall of light felt like diving into warm water, a sensation of displacement and pressure that made my ears pop and my vision blur. For a moment that stretched like hours, I felt suspended between realities, surrounded by whispers in languages I didn't recognize, and the overwhelming scent of copper pennies and autumn leaves. My truck's engine roared in protest, the sound echoing strangely in the red-tinted space that had swallowed us whole. Then suddenly I was through, bursting back onto normal highway with such violence that my trailer fishtailed slightly before I regained control. The trees on both sides were ordinary again, showing the usual autumn colors under a star-filled sky that looked exactly as it should have. My CB immediately came alive with normal trucker chatter, and when I checked my GPS, I found myself exactly where I should have been according to my original timeline, as if the extended miles through the red forest had never happened. I pulled into a truck stop in Grayling 20 minutes later, my hands still shaking as I shut down the engine and climbed out to inspect my rig. Everything looked normal, except for a fine coating of red dust that covered my entire truck like pollen, despite the fact that I'd given it a thorough wash just that morning. The dust came off easily when I wiped it with my sleeve, dissolving like powdered rust and leaving no stain behind. Inside the truck stop, I cornered an old-timer named Pete, who'd been running these highways even longer than I had. When I described what I'd experienced, his face went pale beneath his weathered tan, and he nodded slowly as if he'd been expecting someone to tell him this story eventually. He explained that every few years, drivers reported the red trees along various stretches of Highway 49, always at night, always when they were alone. Most who encountered them were never seen again, but a few like me managed to push through to the other side. According to Pete, the red was some kind of boundary marker, a warning that you'd wandered into a part of the highway that wasn't quite connected to the rest of the world anymore. The trees were trying to help, he said, showing drivers they still had a chance to turn back before they crossed into whatever lay beyond that wall of light. Those who stopped or tried to leave their vehicles in the red zone joined whatever presence haunted that stretch of road, becoming part of the forest themselves. I finished my run to Marquette without further incident, but I've never forgotten that night or the faces I saw reaching out from within the crimson glow. Every time I drive Highway 49 after dark, I find myself scanning the tree line nervously, watching for the first hints of red among the autumn leaves. And sometimes late at night when the CB is quiet and the highway stretches empty ahead of me, I wonder if those red trees are still out there somewhere, waiting patiently for the next driver. The Mirror Roads of Clearwater. From Jake Morrison, The GPS had been acting strange for the last 100 miles, its screen flickering between normal blue highways and something that looked like a spiderweb of silver threads. I should have pulled over at that last truck stop. Should have called dispatch about the detour, but the deadline for my delivery to Portland was breathing down my neck like exhaust fumes. When you're hauling 26 tons of electronics across 3 states, every hour counts. And the fuel gauge was telling me I could make it if I took this shortcut through the mountains. The device finally settled on a route that promised to save me 40 miles, threading through a town called Clearwater that wasn't on any of my paper maps. My Kenworth hummed its familiar diesel lullaby as we climbed into the Cascade foothills, the engine working harder against the grade. Outside my windshield, Douglas firs crowded the narrow highway like mourners at a funeral, their branches creating a canopy so thick that my headlights seemed to barely penetrate the darkness ahead. The radio had been cycling through static for 20 minutes, occasionally catching fragments of late-night talk shows before dissolving back into white noise. I'd driven these mountains before, but never on this particular stretch of asphalt, and something about the way the road curved felt unfamiliar, as if it was guiding me somewhere I'd never intended to go. The first sign that something was different came when my headlights caught the reflection ahead. At first, I thought it might be water on the road, maybe a small flood from the mountain streams, but as I downshifted and approached more carefully, I realized the pavement itself was gleaming. Not wet gleaming, but bright and clean like polished chrome, stretching ahead of me in perfect mirror-smooth ribbons that seemed to catch and amplify every photon from my headlights. I eased off the accelerator, watching the speedometer drop from 55 to 40, then 35, as my truck's massive weight carried us onto what felt like driving across a frozen lake. The sound changed first. Instead of the familiar rumble of 18 wheels against asphalt, there was something else, something crystalline and musical, like wind chimes made of broken bottles. My trailer began to track differently behind me, swaying just slightly as if the surface beneath us had no texture, no grip, nothing for the rubber to hold on to. Through my side mirrors, I watched my own headlights reflecting back at me from the road surface, creating the unsettling illusion that there was another truck driving upside down beneath me, matching my every movement. That's when I saw the town. Clearwater appeared in my windshield like a mirage, its streetlights glowing soft and orange in the mountain darkness. But as my truck rolled down the main thoroughfare, I realized that every single road in this place was made of the same mirror-bright material, creating a network of reflective arteries that caught and bounced light in impossible directions. Street signs reflected themselves infinitely in the pavement below, creating vertical columns of text that seemed to stretch down into the earth. The few buildings I could see, a gas station, what looked like a small diner, a handful of houses with dark windows, all appeared to be floating above their own perfect reflections, as if the entire town had been built on top of a vast, still lake. I pulled into the gas station, more out of curiosity than need, and set the air brakes with their familiar hiss. When I climbed down from the cab, my boots made tiny clicking sounds against the mirror surface, and I found myself staring down at my own reflection, perfectly clear and undistorted, as if I were standing on polished glass. The sensation was deeply unsettling, like looking into water that was impossibly deep and clear. I could see every detail of my face and clothes reflected back at me, but there was something wrong with the angle, something that made it seem like my reflection was looking back up at me from somewhere very far away. The gas pumps were the old-fashioned kind, with analog dials and mechanical numbers that clicked and rolled as they turned. But they too cast perfect reflections in the road surface, creating the illusion of pumps extending both up into the night sky and down into the depths of the earth. When I tried to use my credit card, the reader seemed to work normally, but the numbers on the display appeared both on the pump itself and in its reflection below, creating a disorienting double image that made me feel slightly dizzy. As my truck's tank filled, I walked around the vehicle, ostensibly checking my tires and load securement, but really trying to understand what I was seeing. The mirror roads seemed to extend in every direction from the gas station, creating a perfect grid that reflected the scattered streetlights like stars. In some directions, the reflections created corridors of light that seemed to stretch for miles, while in others, they formed complex patterns that hurt to look at directly. The effect was beautiful and disturbing at the same time, like being inside a kaleidoscope designed by someone who understood geometry in ways that human minds weren't meant to comprehend. That's when I noticed the other vehicles. They were parked along the side streets, barely visible in the ambient glow of the streetlights, but their reflections in the road surface were crystal clear. Cars, trucks, motorcycles, even what looked like bicycles, all sitting perfectly still above their mirror images. At first, I assumed they belonged to the residents of Clearwater, but as I looked more carefully, I realized that many of them appeared to be covered in dust, as if they had been sitting there for a very long time. Some of the license plates I could make out in the reflections were from different decades, different states, even different countries. I walked closer to examine a sedan that was parked near the edge of the gas station property. It was a late-model Honda. Nothing unusual about it except for the thick layer of dust on the windshield and the way the tires seemed to have settled into the mirror road surface as if they had been there for months. When I peered through the driver's side window, I could see personal belongings scattered on the seats. A coffee cup, sunglasses, what looked like a road atlas folded open to a page I couldn't quite read. But the car was empty, and when I tried the door handle, it opened easily as if it had never been locked. The silence in Clearwater was absolute. No wind, no insects, no distant highway noise, just the occasional settling sound from my cooling truck engine and the strange musical tinkling that seemed to come from the road surface itself whenever anything moved across it. I called out a simple, "Hello," and my voice seemed to carry both up into the night air and down into the reflective street, creating a strange echo that sounded like someone answering me from underground. I was walking back toward my truck when I saw the footprints. They were clearly visible in the mirror surface of the road, not as impressions or marks, but as dark shadows that seemed to exist within the reflection itself. The prints led from the abandoned Honda to the sidewalk, then along the main street toward what looked like the town center. But here's what made my skin crawl. The footprints were only visible in the reflection. When I looked at the actual surface of the road, I could see nothing. No marks or impressions of any kind. It was only when I looked down at the mirror image that I could see the clear outline of someone's shoes, walking away from their car and deeper into Clearwater. More disturbing still, as I followed the reflected footprints with my eyes, I began to see others. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all leading in the same direction, all visible only in the reflected world below the surface. Some looked fresh, sharp-edged and dark, while others appeared faded, as if they had been there for years. The trail of reflected footsteps created a pathway that seemed to lead toward the center of town, where the grid of mirror roads converged into what looked like a small park or town square. Against every instinct I had, I found myself following those reflected footprints, walking along the gleaming street while staring down at the underground world that seemed to exist parallel to the real Clearwater. My boots continued to make their small clicking sounds with each step, and I realized that my own footprints were now joining the others in the reflection. Dark impressions that appeared in the mirror world, even though they left no mark on the actual road surface. The town square, when I reached it, was a circular plaza where 5 mirror roads came together like the spokes of a wheel. In the center stood what appeared to be a gazebo or bandstand, a simple wooden structure that looked perfectly normal except for the way it seemed to float above its own reflection. All of the footprints I had been following converged here, creating a dense carpet of dark impressions that surrounded the gazebo like the shadows of a crowd that had gathered for some long-ago performance. That's when I heard the music. It was faint at first, just a whisper of melody that seemed to come from the road surface itself, as if the mirror streets were somehow conducting sound waves from somewhere far below. The Midnight Passenger, from Jake Morrison. The rain had been my companion for the last 200 miles, drumming a steady rhythm against the windshield of my Peterbilt as I rolled through the Oregon wilderness. It was the kind of night that made even veteran drivers like myself grateful for the warm glow of the dashboard lights and the reliable hum of the diesel engine beneath me. I'd been hauling timber roots for 15 years, and these mountain highways had become as familiar as the lines on my weathered hands. But tonight felt different somehow, heavy with an expectation I couldn't name. The CB radio crackled with the occasional exchange between drivers heading south, their voices cutting through the static like distant lighthouse beams in an ocean of white noise. My cargo of Douglas fir lumber was bound for Sacramento, and I was making good time despite the weather. The windshield wipers swept back and forth in their hypnotic dance, clearing away sheets of water that caught my headlights like liquid silver. The highway stretched ahead, empty and glistening, bordered by towering pines that swayed in the storm like dark sentinels keeping watch over the night. It was just past midnight when I first spotted the figure, standing at the roadside pull-off near milepost 1 to 27. Through the rain-blurred passenger window, I could make out the silhouette of someone hunched against the weather, thumb extended in the universal gesture of those seeking passage. In 15 years of long-haul driving, I'd picked up my share of stranded travelers, mostly truckers whose rigs had broken down, or travelers whose cars had given up the ghost in these remote stretches. Something about the lonely figure tugged at whatever remained of my conscience after years of seeing too much of humanity's darker corners. I downshifted and pulled the big rig onto the shoulder, air brakes hissing like some great mechanical beast settling down for rest. Through the passenger mirror, I watched the figure approach, moving with an odd, careful gait that I attributed to the uneven gravel and driving rain. The dome light illuminated the cab's interior as I leaned across to open the passenger door, and the sudden rush of cold, wet air carried with it the smell of pine and something else, something earthy and wild that reminded me of hunting trips with my father decades ago. "Appreciate the ride," came a voice from below, and I looked down to see a man in his 30s or 40s, though it was hard to tell in the dim light. He was wearing a heavy wool coat that had seen better days, and a knit cap pulled low over his eyes. Water dripped from his clothing as he climbed up into the cab, moving with that same careful, deliberate motion I'd noticed from a distance. "Name's Thomas," he said, settling into the passenger seat with what sounded like relief. "Jake," I replied, studying him in the green glow of the dashboard lights. There was something unusual about the way he held his head, slightly tilted forward as if the weight of his wool cap was more than expected. His hands were pale in the instrument panel's illumination, and I noticed he kept them folded carefully in his lap. "Where you headed, Thomas?" "South," he answered simply, his voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't quite place, something that reminded me of the old-timers who'd worked the lumber camps in my grandfather's day. "Anywhere south will do just fine. Car broke down about 10 miles back. Been walking for hours." He turned slightly toward me but kept his face angled downward, the brim of his cap casting deep shadows across his features. I shifted back into gear and pulled onto the highway, the weight of the trailer settling into its familiar rhythm behind us. The rain continued its relentless percussion against the windshield, and the heater worked overtime to clear the fog that our breath created in the suddenly humid cab. Thomas sat quietly beside me, occasionally shifting in his seat with small, precise movements that suggested he was uncomfortable but trying not to show it. "Hell of a night to be walking," I commented, trying to make conversation as we rolled through a particularly dark stretch where the trees pressed close to the roadway. "Good thing I came along when I did." "Yes," Thomas agreed, his voice barely audible over the engine noise. "Very fortunate timing." There was something in his tone that made me glance sideways at him, but he remained motionless, hands folded, head tilted forward in that odd posture. I don't often travel at night, but circumstances required it. The miles rolled by beneath us, and I found myself growing increasingly aware of my passenger's unusual stillness. Most hitchhikers I'd picked up over the years had been chatty, eager to share their stories or at least make small talk to pass the time. Thomas seemed content to sit in silence, occasionally making small adjustments to his position that I began to realize were related to his cap, which he touched and adjusted with surprising frequency. It was during one of these adjustments that I caught a glimpse of something that made my hands tighten imperceptibly on the steering wheel. In the brief moment when Thomas raised his hand to his cap, the dashboard lights caught something pale projecting from beneath the wool, something that looked remarkably like bone. I told myself it was a trick of the light, perhaps part of his coat collar or some kind of medical device, but the image lingered in my mind like an unwelcome photograph. "You feeling all right there, Thomas?" I asked, keeping my voice casual despite the sudden tension I felt creeping up my spine. "You seem a little uncomfortable." "The cap," he said after a long pause. "It's become rather tight during the walk. The rain, you know, wool shrinks when wet." His hand moved to the brim again, and this time I was watching more carefully. What I saw made my mouth go dry and my foot ease slightly off the accelerator. Beneath the edge of the wool cap, unmistakably illuminated by the green glow of the instrument panel, were what appeared to be the tips of antlers, not the broken remnants of some hunting trophy or costume piece, but living bone, pale and branching, growing directly from Thomas's skull. As he adjusted the cap, trying to conceal them more completely, I could see that the wool had been stretched and modified to accommodate their presence. "Jesus," I whispered, more to myself than to him, but Thomas heard and turned slightly in my direction. For the first time since he'd entered the cab, I could see his eyes clearly, and they reflected the dashboard lights with an intensity that was distinctly non-human, golden and bright like those of a deer caught in headlights. "Please don't be alarmed, Jake," Thomas said, his voice taking on a quality I hadn't noticed before, something that resonated strangely in the confined space of the cab. "I mean you no harm. I simply need to travel south before dawn. It's very important that I reach my destination before the sun rises." The rational part of my mind was screaming at me to pull over immediately, to get this thing out of my truck and put as much distance as possible between us. But something in Thomas's voice, a note of genuine desperation, kept my hand steady on the wheel and my foot on the accelerator. I'd seen strange things in my years on the road, encountered people living on society's margins who didn't fit into neat categories, but nothing had prepared me for this. "What are you?" I asked, the question coming out more calmly than I felt. The storm outside seemed to intensify in response, rain hammering against the windshield with renewed fury, and the wind began to rock the trailer behind us. "I'm someone who made a mistake," Thomas replied, removing his cap entirely. The antlers that were revealed were magnificent and terrible, branching from his skull in perfect symmetry, white as fresh snow and eerily beautiful in the dashboard's glow. Someone who wandered too far into the deep woods during the wrong season, who stayed too long in places where the old rules still apply. As he spoke, I began to notice other changes in his appearance. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and his fingers, no longer hidden in his lap, ended in what looked more like hooves than nails. The smell I'd noticed when he first entered the cab was stronger now, the scent of deep forest and wild things, mixed with something else that reminded me of autumn leaves and morning frost. "There are places in these mountains," Thomas continued, his voice growing more urgent as he stared out at the darkness rushing past, "where the boundaries between worlds grow thin, places where a man can lose himself if he's not careful, where he can become something else entirely. I've been trying to find my way back for 3 years now, but every dawn drives me further from what I used to be." The highway ahead curved sharply to the left, following the contours of a deep ravine, and as we rounded the bend, my headlights swept across something that made my blood freeze. Standing in the roadway were a dozen or more figures, all motionless, all watching our approach with the same golden eyes that Thomas possessed. The carousel. For Marcus, the first time I noticed the trailer spinning, I thought it was the bourbon talking. 3 days into a cross-country haul from Portland to Jacksonville, and the loneliness of the interstate had started playing tricks on my mind. The amber glow of my dashboard clock read 2:17 in the morning, and somewhere outside Amarillo, the world had shrunk down to nothing but my headlights carving through the Texas darkness and the steady rumble of my Peterbilt's engine beneath me. I'd been driving for nearly 20 years, hauling everything from lumber to livestock, and I'd seen my share of strange things on the night roads. Phantom hitchhikers that vanished when you looked twice, lights in the sky that moved too purposefully to be planes. Once, outside of Bakersfield, I swear I saw a gas station that wasn't there when I came back through the next week. But this was different. This was right there in my mirrors, spinning slow and deliberate like some kind of highway carousel. The trailer belonged to another trucker I'd been leapfrogging with since Oklahoma City. We'd passed each other half a dozen times the way drivers do on long hauls, one pulling ahead for fuel or food, the other catching up during a rest break. His rig was a midnight blue Kenworth, older model but well-maintained, pulling what looked like a standard 53-foot dry van. Nothing unusual about it except for the way the trailer seemed to rotate ever so slightly as it moved down the highway. At first I convinced myself it was an optical illusion. The play of my headlights on his reflective tape, maybe, or the way heat mirages can make pavement shimmer even on cool autumn nights. But as the miles rolled by and we continued our unconscious game of highway tag, I couldn't shake the image from my peripheral vision. Every time he pulled ahead of me, there it was in my windshield, that subtle turning motion, as if the entire trailer was mounted on some invisible axis. The radio had been quiet for hours, just the occasional crackle of distant CB chatter too faint to make out clearly. I reached for the handset and keyed the mic, trying to raise the blue Kenworth on channel 19. "Hey there, blue truck about a mile ahead of me. You got your ears on?" Static answered me, punctuated by the soft whistle of wind through my slightly open window. I tried again, checking different channels, but got nothing back except the void. A light rain had started to fall, speckling my windshield with droplets that caught and scattered my headlight beams. I flicked on the wipers and their rhythmic sweep created an almost hypnotic pattern against the glass. That's when I noticed something that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. In the brief moments when my wipers cleared the windshield completely, I could see the trailer ahead of me more clearly, and the spinning motion was definitely not my imagination. The entire 53-foot box was rotating slowly around its central axis, making perhaps one complete revolution every 30 seconds. It should have been impossible. The trailer was still tracking straight down the highway, still properly connected to the tractor pulling it, but the cargo box itself was turning like a massive steel cylinder. I blinked hard and rubbed my eyes, wondering if I'd been driving too long, but when I looked again, there it was, still spinning with that same deliberate, mesmerizing motion. I tried the CB radio again, this time broadcasting on the emergency channel. "This is eastbound I-40. Anyone else seeing the blue Kenworth with the spinning trailer?" My voice sounded thin and strange in the cab, barely audible over the drum of rain on my roof. The radio hissed back at me with empty static, as if I were the only person left on the entire interstate system. The speedometer showed I was holding steady at 72 miles per hour, but the blue truck ahead seemed to be maintaining the exact same speed, keeping that consistent distance between us. I pressed down on the accelerator, watching my speed climb to 75, then 80, but somehow the gap never closed. The spinning trailer remained exactly where it had been, turning slowly in the rain-streaked darkness ahead of me like a beacon I could never quite reach. That's when I started noticing other details that didn't make sense. The blue Kenworth's running lights were on, the required markers and clearance lamps that make big rigs visible from a distance, but they seemed too bright, almost luminescent in the wet night air. And the pattern was wrong somehow. Federal regulations require specific light configurations on commercial vehicles, patterns I'd memorized through 2 decades of professional driving. But this truck's lights seemed to pulse and shift in sequences I didn't recognize. I reached for my phone to take a video, thinking maybe I could prove to myself later that this was real. But the screen remained black no matter how many times I pressed the power button. The device felt cold in my hand, colder than the autumn air flowing through my barely cracked window. I set it aside and focused on the road ahead, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The rain was getting heavier now, and I had to slow down as visibility decreased. My wipers were working overtime, but they couldn't keep up with the downpour that seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. Through the sheets of water cascading across my windshield, the spinning trailer ahead took on an even more surreal quality, its rotating motion creating strange patterns in the reflected light. I tried to change lanes, thinking maybe I could pull alongside the blue truck and get a better look at what was happening. But every time I signaled and started to move over, other traffic appeared as if from nowhere. Phantom vehicles with no lights, no sound, just dark shapes that forced me back into my lane before disappearing entirely. It was as if something was determined to keep me exactly where I was. Following at this precise distance behind the impossible spinning trailer, the engine of my Peterbilt began to make a sound I'd never heard before, a low harmonic hum that seemed to resonate through the entire cab. The vibration traveled up through the steering wheel into my hands, and I could feel it in my chest, a deep thrumming that matched the rhythm of the spinning trailer ahead. My truck's gauges all showed normal readings. Oil pressure good, coolant temperature in the green, but that sound continued, growing gradually louder as the miles passed. I realized I hadn't seen another vehicle in either direction for over an hour. No eastbound traffic, no westbound headlights in the distance, just me and the blue Kenworth on an endless stretch of interstate that seemed to exist outside of normal space and time. The mile markers I passed were blurred by the rain, their numbers impossible to read, and I began to wonder if I was even still on I-40 or if somehow I'd taken an exit onto some other road without realizing it. The spinning trailer was getting closer now, though I hadn't increased my speed. The distance between us was shrinking despite my foot holding steady on the accelerator, and I could see more details of its impossible rotation. The cargo box turned with perfect mechanical precision, but there was no visible mechanism making it happen. No exposed gears or drive system, just that smooth, relentless revolution that defied every law of physics and engineering I understood. As I drew nearer, I could make out text on the side of the trailer, letters that became visible as each face rotated toward me, but the words made no sense. Symbols and characters that looked almost like English but weren't quite right, as if someone had tried to recreate human writing from memory and gotten the details wrong. The letters seemed to shift and change even as I watched, rearranging themselves into new configurations with each revolution of the spinning box. My CB radio crackled to life suddenly, filling the cab with a voice that sounded like it was coming from very far away. "Following too close, driver," the voice said, and I realized it was coming from the blue Kenworth ahead of me. Might want to back off a bit. But the voice was wrong somehow, too deep and resonant to be entirely human, with strange harmonics that made my teeth ache. I grabbed the handset with shaking hands and keyed the mic. "What's going on with your trailer?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "How is it spinning like that?" The response came immediately, but the voice seemed to be coming from inside my own cab now, not from the radio at all. "Some cargo needs to stay in motion," it said, and I felt my blood turn to ice water in my veins. Some things can't be allowed to settle. I looked around frantically, but I was alone in the cab. The voice had seemed to come from right beside me, close enough that I should have felt breath on my ear. The spinning trailer ahead was almost within touching distance now, close enough that I could see my own headlight beams reflecting off its polished surface as it turned. That's when I saw what was inside. Through what should have been solid metal walls, I caught glimpses of the cargo with each revolution of the spinning trailer. Dark shapes that moved independently of the rotation, the mirror that strikes back. From Jake Morrison, the chrome on my Peterbilt has always been my pride, every surface polished to a mirror finish that could blind a man at sunrise. 23 years I've been running this route between Denver and Salt Lake City, and in all that time I've never seen anything in my mirrors that shouldn't have been there. Until last Tuesday night, when the storm rolled in from the west like God's own anger, and I learned that sometimes what looks back at you isn't just a reflection. The weather had been building all afternoon. Those towering black clouds that seemed to scrape the belly of heaven itself. I was making good time on I-80, my rig loaded down with electronics bound for a distribution center in Salt Lake, when the first drops started hitting my windshield like scattered pennies. The wipers swept them away with their familiar rhythm, that hypnotic back and forth that had lulled me through countless nights on the road. My CB crackled with warnings from other drivers about the storm system moving in fast, but I figured I could outrun the worst of it. The rain came down harder as the sun disappeared behind the wall of clouds, turning the world outside my cab into a gray-washed nightmare. I adjusted my driver's side mirror, angling it just right to catch the headlights of any vehicle coming up behind me. The chrome surface reflected back the storm-darkened sky, rain droplets racing across its surface like tiny silver bullets. Everything looked normal, just the empty highway stretching out behind me painted yellow by my running lights. That's when I first noticed something odd about the reflection. Not what I was seeing, but what I was feeling. Every time I glanced at that mirror, I got the strangest sensation, like someone was watching me watch them. You know that prickly feeling you get on the back of your neck when you're sure someone's staring at you from across a crowded diner? It was exactly like that, except the only thing behind me was miles of empty interstate and rain. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the storm making me jittery. 23 years of driving and I'd never been spooked by a little weather. But as the rain intensified and the wind started buffeting my trailer, that feeling in the mirror got stronger. It was like looking into water that was looking back. Every time my eyes found that chrome surface, I felt this pull. This strange magnetic draw that made it hard to look away. Around midnight, somewhere between Rock Springs and Green River, the feeling changed from uncomfortable to downright unsettling. I was adjusting the mirror again, just a small tweak to get a better view of the road behind me when I saw it. For just a split second, reflected in that polished chrome, I swear I saw a face that wasn't mine looking back. Not behind me in the cab, but actually in the mirror itself, like it was coming from inside the reflection. The face was pale and gaunt, with eyes that seemed too large for its head, and it was staring right at me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I jerked my head around to look directly behind me, but of course there was nothing there, just the empty sleeper berth and my duffel bag on the passenger seat. When I looked back at the mirror, all I saw was my own weathered face, lit by the green glow of my instrument panel. I told myself it was fatigue, that I'd been pushing too hard and needed to find a truck stop to grab some coffee and maybe catch a few hours of sleep. But even as I tried to rationalize what I'd seen, I couldn't shake the image of those two large eyes staring back at me. There had been something hungry in that gaze, something that made my skin crawl even thinking about it. The storm was getting worse, the rain now coming down in sheets so thick my wipers could barely keep up. I had to slow down to 45, then 40, my hazard lights blinking as I crept through the deluge. Other trucks were pulling off at every exit, but I was stubborn, determined to make my delivery on time. I kept my eyes fixed on the road ahead, trying to ignore the mirror that seemed to pulse with its own malevolent energy. That's when it happened the first time. I was checking my blind spot before changing lanes when something in the mirror moved wrong. Instead of showing me the reflection of my own hand reaching for the turn signal, the mirror showed a different hand, pale and thin, reaching back toward me from inside the reflection. I yanked my hand back instinctively, and the strange hand in the mirror mimicked the movement, but a split second too late, like it was trying to catch up with reality. My heart was hammering now, and I could feel sweat on my forehead despite the air conditioning. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white in the dashboard lights. This wasn't fatigue. This wasn't my imagination. Something was very wrong with that mirror, something that defied every rational explanation I could think of. I tried covering the mirror with a shop rag, but every time I took my eyes off the road to do it, the wind would tear it away. It was like the mirror didn't want to be covered, didn't want to be hidden from view. And the strangest part was that I found myself looking at it more and more frequently, drawn to it despite every instinct telling me to keep my eyes on the road. The second time it happened was worse, much worse. I was coming around a long, sweeping curve when I glanced at the mirror and saw myself, but wrong somehow. The reflection showed me turning the wheel to the right, but I was turning it to the left. The reflection showed me smiling, a cold, predatory smile that I wasn't making. And then, as I watched in horror, the reflection of my hand started moving independently, reaching up toward the surface of the mirror like it was trying to break through. That's when I felt it, a sharp, stinging sensation across my left cheek like someone had slapped me, hard. The pain was real and immediate, and I could feel the heat spreading across my face. But there was no one in the cab with me, no one who could have possibly reached me. I touched my cheek and felt the raised welts where fingers had struck flesh. The mirror had slapped me back. I swerved slightly, caught off guard by the impossibility of what had just happened, and had to fight to keep the rig on the road. The rain was coming down even harder now, and the wind was howling like a living thing. I wanted to pull over, to get as far away from that mirror as possible, but every exit was either closed or led to roads that were already flooded. As the minutes crawled by, the attacks became more frequent and more violent. Every time I looked at the mirror, which I found myself doing compulsively now, that other version of myself would move differently, act differently, and every time it did, I would feel the physical impact. A punch to the shoulder that left me gasping. A grab at my wrist that left finger-shaped bruises. A shove that nearly sent me careening into the guardrail. The thing in the mirror was getting stronger, more aggressive. I could see it in those two large eyes that had replaced my own in the reflection. There was a malevolent intelligence there, something that wanted to hurt me, to take my place somehow. And with each passing mile, the boundary between the reflection and reality seemed to be wearing thinner. I was fighting now, actually fighting with my own reflection. Every time it would reach for me, I would try to pull away, but the movements were getting more synchronized, more difficult to resist. It was like the thing in the mirror was learning how to control me, how to make me move the way it wanted me to move. The worst moment came when I saw the reflection reach for the steering wheel. Not my hands, but its hands, pale and wrong, gripping the wheel and trying to turn it toward the median barrier. I felt my own hands being forced to follow the motion, felt control of my truck slipping away as something else tried to take over. The big rig started to drift left, toward the concrete divider that separated the eastbound and westbound lanes. I fought back with everything I had, throwing my whole body into turning the wheel back to the right. The physical sensation was incredible, like arm wrestling with someone who had exactly my strength but no concern for my safety. Sweat was pouring down my face now, mixing with the rain that had somehow started getting into the cab despite the closed windows. For a moment I thought I was going to lose. The thing in the mirror was pulling the wheel harder to the left, and I could see the concrete barrier rushing up to meet us. But then, just as we were about to hit, I managed to catch a glimpse of the mirror from the corner of my eye and saw something that gave me hope. The reflection was flickering, like a bad television signal, wavering between the twisted version of myself and normal chrome reflection. I realized that the storm was interfering with whatever force was animating the mirror. Every flash of lightning, every rumble of thunder. The route that finds you. From Marcus, the GPS unit mounted on my Peterbilt's dashboard had been acting strange for 3 days when I first noticed the pulse. Not strange in the usual way. Frozen screens, outdated maps, that robotic voice mispronouncing exit names, but strange in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up during those long stretches of interstate darkness. It would reroute me without warning, taking me down farm roads I'd never seen before, then somehow deliver me exactly where I needed to be, often ahead of schedule. I'd been running freight between Minneapolis and Denver for the better part of 15 years. Knew every truck stop, every way station, every shortcut worth taking, but this little black box, no bigger than a smartphone, seemed to know roads that didn't exist on any map I'd ever consulted. Roads that felt older than the landscape around them, cutting through wheat fields and pine forests with an authority that suggested they'd been there long before. The first surveyor ever set foot in these territories, the pulse started on a Tuesday night somewhere outside, North Platte, Nebraska. Rain drummed against my windshield in that hypnotic way that makes your eyelids heavy after 12 hours behind the wheel. I was reaching for my coffee when I saw it, a faint rhythmic glow emanating from the GPS screen. Not the usual blue backlight, but something deeper, more organic. It pulsed like a heartbeat, slow and steady, painting my hands and the interior of the cab in waves of amber light. I pulled over at the next rest area, engine idling, windshield wipers keeping time with that strange luminescence. The screen showed my location accurately enough, a small blue dot on Highway 80, but there was something else now. A thin red line, barely visible, tracing a route that veered north through what the map labeled as empty farmland. No road names, no mile markers, just that crimson thread stretching into digital darkness. The rational part of my mind, the part that had kept me safe through decades of night driving, told me to ignore it. Stick to the interstate, make my delivery in Denver, get the unit checked by a technician. But there was something compelling about that pulse, something that seemed to resonate not just with the ambient hum of my diesel engine, but with something deeper, something in my chest that matched its rhythm beat for beat. I merged back onto the highway, determined to ignore whatever electronic malfunction was causing this display. But 3 miles later, the GPS spoke in a voice I'd never heard before. Not the familiar female tone I'd grown accustomed to, but something warmer, more intimate, almost familial. "Take the next right, Marcus," it said, and the way it pronounced my name sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the October air seeping through my door seals. "There's something you need to see." The exit it directed me toward wasn't marked on any sign I could see, just a narrow gap in the guardrail that led to a gravel road disappearing into stands of corn that should have been harvested weeks ago. My headlights cut through the rain and illuminated stalks that stood unnaturally tall, their leaves rustling in a wind I couldn't feel from inside the cab. The pulse from the GPS grew stronger, more insistent, and I found myself downshifting, taking that unmarked turn despite every instinct screaming at me to maintain course. The gravel road was smooth, too smooth for something that didn't officially exist. It wound through the cornfield for what felt like miles, though my odometer suggested I'd traveled less than half that distance. Time seemed elastic here, stretched thin like taffy, and the rain that had been so persistent on the highway faded to a light mist that seemed to glow in my headlight beams. The corn gave way to pasture land, then to forest. Pine trees so tall and thick they formed a canopy overhead that blocked out the sky entirely. "You're almost there," the GPS whispered, and now I was certain it was whispering. The volume dropping so low I had to lean forward to hear it over my engine's rumble. The pulse was everywhere now, not just on the screen, but in the dashboard lights, in the reflection off my mirrors, even in the rhythm of my turn signals when I navigated the increasingly sharp curves that carved through this impossible landscape. The road crested a hill and suddenly opened into a clearing I knew I'd never seen before, yet felt intimately familiar with. An old truck stop sat in the center, its neon sign casting pink and blue light across empty parking spaces. The building looked like something from the 50s, all chrome and glass, with a lunch counter visible through windows that glowed with warm yellow light. But it was the parking lot that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. Every space was filled with trucks, dozens of them, all perfectly restored classics from decades past. Peterbilts and Kenworths, Freightliners and Macs, their chrome polished to mirror brightness despite the mist that hung in the air. I pulled into the only empty space, right in front of the diner, and shut down my engine. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by the settling clicks of cooling metal and the soft whisper of that persistent mist. The GPS screen still pulsed, but slower now, almost peaceful. And the red line that had guided me here had changed. Now it showed dozens of routes, hundreds of them, spreading out from this location like a spider's web, covering the entire continental United States in a network of paths that existed nowhere on official maps. Inside the diner, the other drivers sat at the counter, their conversations a low murmur that seemed to blend with the pulse that had brought me here. They looked up as I entered, faces I didn't recognize but that somehow seemed familiar, and nodded the universal greeting that passes between those who make their living on the road. The waitress, a woman with gray hair and kind eyes, poured me coffee without being asked and smiled in a way that suggested she'd been expecting me. "First time following the pulse?" she asked, and her voice carried the same intimate warmth as the GPS that had guided me here. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and she patted my shoulder with maternal affection. "It finds the ones who need finding," she said. "The ones who've been driving the same routes for so long, they've forgotten there are other ways to get where you're going. Other places to go entirely." I spent what felt like hours in that diner listening to stories from drivers who claimed to have been following the pulse for years, decades even. They spoke of deliveries to towns that didn't appear on any map, cargo that seemed to load and unload itself, and always, the GPS units that pulsed with that organic light, guiding them to places that existed in the spaces between official routes. When I finally returned to my truck, the eastern sky was showing the first hints of dawn, though my watch insisted it was still the middle of the night. The GPS screen showed the familiar blue glow of normal operation, with a perfectly reasonable route back to Highway 80 clearly marked. The other trucks in the parking lot were gone, leaving only dark patches on the asphalt where they'd been parked. And when I looked back at the diner, its windows were dark. Its neon sign flickered once and went silent. I made my delivery in Denver on time, exactly as scheduled, despite having spent what felt like half the night in that impossible truck stop. The GPS functioned normally for the rest of the trip, offering no explanation for the detour, no acknowledgement of the pulse that had guided me to that place between places. But sometimes, usually late at night when the highway stretches empty ahead of me and the hum of my engine creates its own hypnotic rhythm, the pulse returns, soft and inviting, showing me routes that lead away from the ordinary world into landscapes that exist only for those who know how to follow. And each time it appears, I find myself wondering not whether I should take those red-lined paths, but whether I'll have the strength to resist their call. The GPS sits silent on my dashboard now, but I can feel it waiting, patient as the road itself, and deep in my chest, matching the rhythm of my heart, I can feel an answering pulse growing stronger with each mile I drive. The Upward Rain, from Eddie Kowalski. The first thing you learn driving long haul is that weather has moods. And tonight the sky was feeling particularly vindictive as I guided my 18-wheeler down the lonely stretch of Highway 287 through eastern Colorado. The rain had started gentle enough around midnight, just a whisper against the windshield that made the wipers squeak in that rhythmic way that usually lulls me toward drowsiness. But I'd been fighting sleep for the better part of 2 hours now, nursing lukewarm coffee from a thermos that had seen better decades, and watching the yellow lines blur past in the glow of my headlights like some hypnotic Morse code, spelling out messages I couldn't quite decipher. The radio had been crackling with static for miles, losing the last country station somewhere back near Lamar, and now it was just me and the steady rumble of the engine, the hiss of tires on wet asphalt, and that increasingly insistent drumming of rain on the cab roof. I'd been hauling refrigerated goods from Denver to Kansas City. Nothing unusual. Just another run in a career that had stretched over 15 years of 2-lane highways and truck stop coffee. The reefer unit hummed its mechanical lullaby behind me, keeping someone's produce fresh while I navigated through the darkness that seemed to press against the windows like something alive. That's when I first noticed something wasn't quite right with the rain. It started as just a nagging feeling, the way you might sense someone watching you from across a crowded diner. But gradually it crystallized into something more concrete and deeply unsettling. The raindrops hitting my windshield weren't behaving the way rain should behave, weren't following the natural laws of gravity and momentum that I'd taken for granted since childhood. Instead of striking the glass and running down in those familiar rivulets, or beating up and getting swept away by the wipers, these drops were hitting and then somehow bouncing back up, defying physics in a way that made my tired brain struggle to process what my eyes were clearly seeing. At first I thought it might be some trick of the headlights, maybe reflecting off the glass at an odd angle, or perhaps I was more exhausted than I'd realized and my vision was playing tricks on me. I rubbed my eyes with one hand while keeping the other steady on the wheel, blinked hard a few times, even tried adjusting the wiper speed to see if that would change anything. But the phenomenon persisted, grew more pronounced, until I couldn't ignore the fact that the rain was definitely, impossibly, bouncing upward from my windshield like tiny liquid ping-pong balls caught in some invisible game between earth and sky. I slowed the truck down to about 40 miles per hour, hazards blinking, and pulled my CB radio from its mount with a shaking hand. The static was thick and ugly, but I managed to raise another driver somewhere out in the darkness, his voice crackling through the interference like a transmission from another world entirely. Breaker 19, this is Freight Train Eddie. Anybody else seeing anything weird with this rain tonight? The response came back distorted but audible, a gravelly voice that identified itself as Moondog Express. What kind of weird you talking about, driver? I hesitated, knowing how crazy it would sound, but the bouncing drops were getting more vigorous now, some of them ricocheting high enough that I could see them arc up and disappear into the darkness above. Rain that's bouncing back up instead of running down, I said finally, and was met with a long silence punctuated only by static. You pulling my leg, freight train? Came Moondog's voice eventually, tinged with uncertainty. 'Cause I got to tell you, I'm seeing some strange stuff myself out here on 83, about 20 miles north of your position. My blood went cold despite the warmth of the cab's heater. What kind of strange stuff? I asked, though I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to know the answer. The static swelled and faded like ocean waves, and when Moondog's voice returned, it was distant and fragmented. Rain's coming up from the ground instead of down from the sky, he said, and then his signal dissolved completely into white noise that made my skin crawl. I set the CB down with trembling fingers and focused on the road ahead, where my headlights were revealing something that made my stomach clench with primal fear. The asphalt was beginning to shimmer with moisture that wasn't accumulating in puddles as it should have been, but instead was forming into tiny fountains that danced and writhed in the beam of my lights like some grotesque water ballet. The rain above was still falling, but now it was meeting this upward flowing moisture in midair, creating swirling patterns that defied every natural law I thought I understood, collision points where water met water, and created spiraling vortices that hung suspended in space before dispersing into fine mist that caught the light like powdered diamonds. The engine's rumble seemed to deepen, taking on harmonics I'd never heard before in 15 years of driving this particular rig, and I realized the rain was starting to affect the truck itself in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Droplets were bouncing off the hood and remaining suspended at window level, clustering together into larger and larger spheres that pulsed with their own internal rhythm, growing and shrinking like transparent hearts beating in slow motion. The windshield wipers were struggling now, making grinding sounds as they tried to clear water that refused to be cleared, that pushed back against the rubber blades with increasing resistance until I could hear the motor straining. I pressed harder on the accelerator, desperate to escape whatever unnatural weather system I'd driven into, but the speedometer needle barely responded, hovering at 45 no matter how much pressure I applied to the pedal. The rain around me was forming patterns now, geometric shapes that shouldn't exist in nature, and I caught glimpses of structures in my peripheral vision, tall columnar formations of swirling water that rose from the highway surface like liquid tornadoes. The air itself seemed to be thickening, becoming viscous and resistant, and breathing was starting to require conscious effort, as if the atmosphere was gradually transforming into something more akin to gel than gas. Then I saw the other trucks, or what remained of them, scattered along both sides of the highway like abandoned toys. They sat perfectly still in the bouncing rain, their running lights dark, their massive forms somehow diminished and hollow-looking in the strange luminescence that the water patterns were beginning to emit. As I passed one particularly large rig, I glimpsed the silhouette of a driver still seated behind the wheel. But there was something wrong with the outline, something that suggested the figure was composed entirely of the same upward-flowing water that was transforming the landscape around us, a liquid echo of humanity trapped in an endless cycle of rising and falling precipitation. The CB radio crackled back to life without my touching it, and Moondog's voice emerged from the static, but it wasn't quite right anymore. Had taken on a fluid quality that made the words seem to splash and drip, rather than simply being spoken. "The rain remembers everything that falls," he said, and I could hear other voices joining in. A chorus of drivers who'd been caught in whatever phenomenon this was, their transmissions overlapping and flowing together like streams converging into a river. Every drop that's ever touched the ground is coming back up now, bringing pieces of everything it's ever been part of. Every puddle and stream and storm drain, every tear and raindrop and flood. My hands were cramping from gripping the steering wheel so tightly, and I could see that the bouncing water was starting to accumulate on the dash and seats, forming small pools that somehow remained perfectly level despite the truck's movement, their surfaces reflecting images that didn't match anything visible through the windows. In one pool I saw a summer day from my childhood, rain puddles in a suburban street where I'd sailed paper boats while thunder rolled overhead. Another showed highways I'd never driven, under skies I'd never seen, carrying loads for companies that might not have existed. The water was remembering, just as the voice on the radio had said, collecting and displaying fragments of every journey, every storm, every moment when precipitation had connected sky to earth. The truck shuddered as if struggling against invisible bonds, and I realized the bouncing rain was forming a kind of net around us. Thousands of tiny trajectories that wove together into a barrier designed to keep us trapped in this impossible weather system. But somewhere in the distance I could see a break in the pattern, a section of highway where the rain fell normally, and the asphalt gleamed with ordinary wetness, and I aimed for that gap with every ounce of determination I could muster. The engine roared as I floored the accelerator, and for a moment, the speedometer climbed towards 60 as we burst through the boundary between the ordinary world and whatever realm of liquid memory we'd stumbled into. The bouncing drops struck the windshield one final time with unusual force, as if making a last desperate attempt to pull us back. But then we were through, driving under normal rainfall that obeyed normal.